The campfire crackled, its embers spitting defiance against the suffocating darkness of the Montana wilderness. James Hartley, 25, sat frozen, his heart pounding louder than the wind howling through the pines. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not here, not now, not with him. The group camping trip was meant to be a reset, a chance for James to escape the suffocating expectations of his small-town life in Bozeman. He'd grown up under the weight of his father's stern gaze, a man who equated masculinity with silence and stoicism. James, with his sharp green eyes and easy charm, had always been the golden boy, captain of the high school soccer team, valedictorian, the one everyone expected to marry a nice girl and settle into a predictable life. But beneath the polished exterior, a secret gnawed at him, one he'd buried so deep it felt like a betrayal to even acknowledge it. That secret had a name: Ethan Caldwell. Ethan, 26, was everything James wasn't: bold, unapologetic, with a laugh that could light up the darkest corners of a room. He'd moved to Bozeman a year ago, a photographer with a knack for capturing the raw beauty of the Rockies. His sun-kissed blonde hair and warm hazel eyes made him stand out in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. James had met him at a local coffee shop, where Ethan's easy smile and quick wit had disarmed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. They'd become friends, close friends, but James had always kept a careful distance, terrified of what might happen if he let himself get too close. Tonight, though, that distance was impossible. The group of 6 had set out for a weekend in the Gallatin National Forest, but a sudden storm had forced them to pair up in tents. James's best friend, Mia, had smirked when she'd assigned him and Ethan to share a tent, her eyes glinting with mischief. "You two will be fine," she'd said, tossing James a blanket. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." Now, as the wind battered the tent and the others slept in their own shelters, James sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, hyper-aware of Ethan's presence just inches away. Ethan was sprawled out, his gray sweater riding up slightly to reveal a sliver of tanned skin. He was reading a dog-eared copy of On the Road, his lips moving silently as he traced the words with a finger. The sight sent a jolt through James, a mix of longing and fear that made his chest ache. "You okay over there?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, low and teasing. He set the book down, his eyes locking onto James's. "You look like you're about to bolt." James forced a laugh, but it came out strained. "Just not used to storms like this." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He shifted closer, the space between them shrinking to nothing. "You sure that's all it is?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. James's pulse raced. He wanted to lie, to brush it off with a joke, but Ethan's gaze held him captive. Those hazel eyes seemed to see right through him, peeling back the layers he'd spent years building. For the first time, James felt exposed, not just to Ethan, but to himself. "I don't know what you mean," James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing James's arm. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a shockwave through James's body. "You don't have to know," Ethan said softly. "Not tonight." They sat there, the storm raging outside, the tension inside the tent thicker than the Montana air. James wanted to pull away, to retreat to the safety of his carefully constructed walls. But something in Ethan's touch, in the quiet certainty of his presence, made him stay. As the night deepened, they talked about nothing and everything. Ethan shared stories of his travels, of late nights in San Francisco bars and sunrise hikes in Colorado. James found himself opening up, too, confessing dreams he'd never spoken aloud: to leave Bozeman, to see the world, to be someone other than the perfect son his father demanded. The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and with each one, James felt a weight lift. When the cold crept in, Ethan pulled a blanket over them, their shoulders brushing as they huddled closer. James's heart thudded so loudly he was sure Ethan could hear it. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid to shatter the fragile moment. But when Ethan's hand found his under the blanket, their fingers intertwining, James didn't pull away. It was the first time he'd ever let himself feel it, the truth he'd buried for years. And as Ethan's thumb traced slow circles on his hand, James realized he was no longer afraid. Morning broke over the Gallatin forest, the storm's fury replaced by a tentative calm. James woke to the sound of birdsong and the warmth of Ethan's arm draped across his chest. For a fleeting moment, he let himself savor it, the closeness, the quiet intimacy, before panic set in. He slipped out from under the blanket, careful not to wake Ethan, and stepped outside into the crisp dawn air. The campsite was still, the others likely sleeping off the late night. James busied himself with starting a fire, his hands trembling as he stacked kindling. Last night had been a mistake. Not because he regretted it. God, he didn't. But because it had opened a door he wasn't sure he could close. He'd spent his life hiding who he was, dodging questions about girlfriends, deflecting his father's pointed remarks. To let himself want Ethan, to let that want become real, was to risk everything. Ethan emerged from the tent, his hair mussed and his smile infuriatingly perfect. "Morning," he said, stretching in a way that made James's stomach flip. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," James lied, poking at the fire. Ethan didn't buy it. He sat beside James, close enough that their knees brushed. "You're freaking out, aren't you?" James opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at the flames, his jaw tight. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted finally. It's not me." Ethan's expression softened. "Maybe it's more you than you think." The words hit harder than James expected. He wanted to argue, to insist that this wasn't his life, that he wasn't that guy. But the memory of Ethan's hand in his, the way it had felt so right, stopped him cold. He wasn't ready to face it. Not yet, but he couldn't deny it, either. The day passed in a blur of hiking and laughter with the group, but James felt like he was moving through a fog. Ethan stayed close, his presence a constant reminder of the night before. Every glance, every accidental touch, sent James's heart racing. By the time they returned to camp for dinner, he was a mess of nerves and unspoken questions. That night, the group gathered around the fire, passing around a bottle of whiskey Mia had smuggled in her pack. The conversation turned to love, as it often did when alcohol loosened tongues. Mia, ever the instigator, leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "So, James," she said, "you ever been in love?" The question landed like a punch. James froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. He could feel Ethan's gaze on him, steady and unyielding. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe." Mia's grin widened, but before she could press further, Ethan spoke up. "Love's tricky," he said, his tone casual but his eyes locked on James. "Sometimes you don't know it's there until it's staring you in the face." The group laughed, oblivious to the undercurrent. James, though, felt like he was drowning. He excused himself, muttering something about needing air, and slipped away from the fire. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the clearing, where the forest swallowed the light. He wasn't alone for long. Ethan found him, his footsteps soft on the pine needles. "You can't keep running from this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not running," James snapped, but the lie tasted bitter. He turned to face Ethan, his chest tight. "You don't get it." If we," he trailed off, unable to say the words. Ethan stepped closer, undeterred. "I get it more than you think. I've been where you are, James. Scared. Hiding. But you don't have to do this alone." The sincerity in Ethan's voice broke something in James. He wanted to believe him, wanted to let go of the fear that had chained him for so long. But the weight of his father's expectations, of the life he'd been taught to want, held him back. "I need time," James said finally, his voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll wait." Back in Bozeman, the weight of normalcy settled over James like a shroud. The camping trip had changed everything, but nothing at all. He went through the motions, working his desk job at a local real estate firm, grabbing beers with friends, dodging his father's calls. But Ethan was everywhere, in the coffee shop where they'd met, in the photos James scrolled through on his phone, in the dreams that left him breathless and aching. He tried to keep his distance, but Ethan made it impossible. He'd show up at James's favorite diner with a grin and a new story, or text him a photo of a sunset with a caption that read, "Wish you were here." Each encounter chipped away at James's resolve, pulling him closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. One evening, James found himself at Ethan's apartment, a small loft filled with photographs and secondhand furniture. Ethan had invited him over to see his latest project, a series of portraits capturing the people of Bozeman. James stood in front of a photo of an elderly rancher, his weathered face etched with pride. "You see people," James said, almost to himself. "Really see them." Ethan shrugged, but his eyes were warm. "I try. People are stories, you know. Everyone's got one." James turned to him, the air between them charged. "What's my story, then?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more serious. "You're still writing it," he said. "But I think it's going to be a good one." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. James felt the pull, the same one he'd felt in the tent, but this time he didn't fight it. He stepped closer, his heart pounding, and kissed Ethan. It was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when Ethan kissed him back, it was like the world fell away. There was no Bozeman, no expectations, no fear, just the two of them, tangled in a moment that felt like it could last forever. When they pulled apart, James was trembling. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw. "You don't have to," Ethan said, his forehead resting against James's. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time, James believed it might be possible. But the world outside Ethan's apartment was waiting, and with it, the reality he'd been avoiding. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet confessions. James and Ethan fell into a rhythm, meeting for late-night drives, sharing coffee at dawn, exploring the unspoken boundaries of their connection. James felt alive in a way he never had, but the fear lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. His father, Robert, was the first to notice the change. Over dinner at the family's sprawling ranch house, he fixed James with a hard stare. "You've been distracted," he said, cutting into his steak. "Something going on?" James's stomach twisted. He'd always been careful, keeping his life neatly compartmentalized. But now, with Ethan, those compartments were crumbling. "Just busy," he said, avoiding his father's eyes. Robert wasn't convinced. "You're not yourself, James. People are talking." The words sent a chill down James's spine. Bozeman was small, and gossip traveled fast. He'd seen the looks at the diner, the raised eyebrows when he and Ethan were together. He told himself it didn't matter, but the thought of his father finding out, of anyone finding out, made his chest tighten. Ethan, sensing James's unease, tried to keep things light. He'd drag James on impromptu adventures, like a midnight hike to a hidden hot spring or a drive to a lookout point where they could see the stars. But even Ethan's warmth couldn't erase the growing tension. One night, as they lay tangled in Ethan's bed, James voiced the fear that had been eating at him. "What if this doesn't work?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if I can't be this person?" Ethan propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. "You already are this person, James. You just have to decide if you're going to let the world tell you who you can love." The words hit hard, but they didn't erase the doubt. James wanted to believe he could be brave, that he could live openly with Ethan. But the weight of his father's expectations, of the life he'd been raised to lead, was a chain he couldn't break. The breaking point came at a community barbecue, an annual event that drew half of Bozeman. James had agreed to go with Ethan, telling himself it was just as friends. But as they laughed over plates of ribs, their shoulders brushing, he caught his father's eye across the crowd. Robert's face was a mask of disapproval, his gaze cutting through James like a knife. Later, in the parking lot, Robert cornered him. "People are talking, James," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't see what's going on? You think I'm blind?" James's heart pounded. "It's not what you think," he said, but the lie felt hollow. "Don't lie to me," Robert snapped. "You're my son. You have a responsibility to this family, to this town. Don't throw it away for him." The words were a gut punch. James wanted to argue, to tell his father he was wrong. But the shame he'd buried for years rose up, choking him. He drove home in silence, Ethan's concerned texts lighting up his phone. That night, James made a choice. He texted Ethan, his hands shaking. "I need space. I'm sorry." Ethan's response was immediate. "Don't do this, James. Talk to me." But James couldn't. He turned off his phone, curled up on his couch, and let the guilt consume him. He'd let himself dream of a life with Ethan, but dreams weren't reality. Reality was his father's disapproval, the whispers in town, the life he was supposed to live. For weeks, James avoided Ethan. He threw himself into work, into the routine of being the perfect son. But every night, the memory of that tent, of Ethan's hand in his, haunted him. He saw Ethan in every corner of Bozeman, in the coffee shop, in the photos on his phone, in the dreams that left him waking in a cold sweat. Months passed, and James's life settled into a hollow routine. He smiled at the right moments, said the right things, but inside, he was unraveling. The absence of Ethan was a wound that wouldn't heal, a constant reminder of the life he'd walked away from. One evening, Mia dragged him to a local art gallery, where Ethan was showcasing his latest work. James didn't want to go, but Mia's persistence was relentless. "You need to see this," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The gallery was packed, the air buzzing with chatter. James's eyes found Ethan immediately, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by his photographs. He looked the same, beautiful, confident, but there was a sadness in his eyes that James hadn't seen before. The centerpiece of the exhibit was a portrait of James, taken during their camping trip. In it, he was laughing, his eyes bright, his face unguarded. The caption read, "The moment I knew." James's throat tightened. He felt Ethan's presence behind him before he heard his voice. "I didn't think you'd come," Ethan said softly. James turned, his heart in his throat. "I didn't want to." Ethan's smile was bittersweet. "But you're here." They stood there, the crowd fading into the background. James wanted to say so much, to apologize, to explain, to beg for another chance. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, Ethan spoke. "I loved you, James. I still do. But I can't keep waiting for you to choose yourself." The words were a knife, but they were also a lifeline. James realized, in that moment, that he'd been living for everyone else, for his father, for the town, for the version of himself he thought he had to be. But the only life that mattered was the one he wanted, the one he'd glimpsed under that blanket in the tent. "I'm sorry," James said, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I still am. But I don't want to lose you." Ethan's eyes softened, but he didn't move closer. "Then don't," he said simply. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. James knew it wouldn't be easy, facing his father, the town, the world. But for the first time, he felt ready to try. He reached for Ethan's hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like coming home. Years later, James would look back on that night in the tent as the moment everything changed. It wasn't just about love, it was about courage, about choosing himself, about building a life that was his own. And every night, as he fell asleep beside Ethan, he knew it was worth it.